Fantastic. Hello, folks. We have lots of people joining right now. It is exactly 12 noon. I am coming at you from Tempe, Arizona. My name is John Watson. I will ask, as people are getting settled in, if you'd use the chat window to let us know who you are, where you are joining us from geographically, and if you're interested, I'd love to know the organization that you're with as well. And we will take a few more minutes to let folks continue to come on board. And we'll get started at maybe 2 minutes past noon. All right, I see Rexburg, Idaho. Fantastic. Cincinnati, Ohio. Very nice. Now everybody's coming in quickly. Let's see where else. Tucson. Fantastic. As I mentioned, I'm in Tempe, so just up the road from Tucson. Andover Academy. Welcome. Pennsylvania, California. Phoenix as well. Harrisburg. Looks like we got kind of a split here. A lot of west and a lot of east. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Alabama, Ventura, California. Another California, another Pennsylvania. Oh, Skip in working with Ben Lapine. Bend, Oregon, what a fantastic place. North Carolina, Oklahoma, very cold Ashland, Wisconsin. Yeah, I understand that. It's not cold here in Arizona, but I'm actually headed up to Colorado in 2 days and gonna feel that. Melbourne, Australia. All right, that will probably win for the furthest away geographically, and probably also furthest in time zone. So thanks for joining us at whatever time of day or night it must be in Melbourne, Australia. Quite a few others. Let's see, all over. A lot more Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Wisconsin, another Wisconsin, another Michigan. All of a sudden, the Midwest is showing up big. North of Vancouver, Canada. All right, we got our second international. Bunch more from middle of the country. The UK, another from overseas. Texas, another not overseas. Toronto, fantastic. Thanks for joining from all these places. Wild and wonderful West Virginia. I like the license plate type commentary as well. So thanks for adding to that. Houston, Texas. All right, looks like we have most of our folks on board. Thank you all for giving us a sense for where you are joining us from, and some of your organizations as well. We are going to get started 3 minutes past the hour here. As I mentioned earlier, but some of you have just joined, my name is John Watson. I'm with the Digital Learning Collaborative. We are an association based here in the US. We also run the Digital Learning Annual Conference. I saw a few of you joining today who I know are going to be joining us at DLAC in Austin, Texas in February. As I mentioned, joining you today from Tempe, Arizona. We are here with a couple of folks that I'm really excited to talk to about AI in education, which, because you're all here, you probably recognize as one of the hottest topics in education right now, and really seems like one of the hottest topics we've had in education in quite a few years. Do want to note a couple of things as more folks are joining from all over the country. Two other things. First of all, we are going to touch on some near-term topics about AI in education that we see mentioned routinely, but we're also going to really want to focus a bit further out, because the technology, when I say further out, I mean more like it's going to happen in 2 to 3 years, because the technology is changing so rapidly. And a main question that we keep asking ourselves is how quickly the education system is going to adapt. And that's a broad topic, and we want to get in there. The second thing I'll mention is we welcome your questions throughout. We ask that you use the chat window, not the Q&A, because in the chat window, everybody can see the questions coming in. I'll be watching, our panelists will be watching as well, and we will be doing our best to get to as many of these questions as possible. All right, we are 5 minutes past the hour. We've got well over 100 people joining us live. Thank you for joining us wherever you're coming in from. I want to get us started by welcoming Justin Bruno from Michigan Virtual. Justin, love to have you come on and just give a little bit of background on what you've been doing, where you are, and that sort of thing.
Sure. Thanks for having me, John. Thanks everyone for attending. I saw some names that I recognize, so that's great. So I work for a company called Michigan Virtual. We're a state-funded nonprofit. We've been around for about 25 years, and we do virtual learning. So that's why and how we're connected with John and DLC. We've been doing that for 25 years, working to develop courses, train instructors, deliver online instruction in an online environment for quite a long time. We've also got a whole side of our house that's devoted to researching the new and next, thinking about R&D in education and how we can test and experiment with new technologies and try to forecast what the impact of those technologies were going to be. And our other kind of third division is in professional learning. So we do a lot of professional learning for educators of all stripes, teachers, administrators, counselors, early childhood care providers, all sorts of folks. My background, I was a social studies teacher in 8th grade in Louisiana, where I'm originally from. Wound up in Michigan and live here with my wife and 2 kids. My wife is also an elementary art teacher. And I had been working at Michigan Virtual on our professional learning team, developing PD on a number of different topics, blended learning, online learning, UDL, all sorts of different topics that might be applied for this kind of technology-rich or blended and virtual instruction environment. Was playing around with some AI tools back in May of last year. Happened to hear folks talking about this on a podcast, a company called OpenAI, and there was a tool that they had at the time called a playground where you could ask this kind of quaint little chat bot some questions and see what it might answer. And the first thing I did was I went to our social studies courses from Michigan Virtual, and I took some of our assignments and I started to plug in some of those questions and assignments into this little chat bot. And I was really astounded just by seeing this text generated and these answers being given. And so internally in the office, I started waving my arms around saying, like, we really need to be paying attention to this. Like, I think this is only going to get more and more capable and better. And then in November of last year, ChatGPT launches. And so we've since then just kind of hit the ground running. We just announced an AI lab at Michigan Virtual, which I'm proud to be a part of. We're doing professional development with teachers around AI, helping them strategically plan around the impact of AI, building awareness. So like you said, every time we go and give a presentation or engage in some kind of engagement, we get asked to do 5 more. So we've been busy, and I'm hoping that we're bringing some nuance to the conversation and providing people with some impactful insights around where AI might be going and how it might change education.
I want to mention that Michigan Virtual is a digital learning collaborative state affiliate. As Justin mentioned, we've been working with Michigan Virtual for a lot of years, and they do tremendous work. So, Justin, just to clarify, when you talked about first playing around and you called it playground, sandbox, whatever you called it, that was pre the public release. That's accurate?
Yeah, that's like the little feather in my cap that I get to say. I was I was
Yeah.
one of the early adopters playing with these, and I had actually written. It's funny. I wrote an article that I had submitted to EdWeek back in like June before ChatGPT were launched, and my article was not accepted. I kind of thought, well, maybe once ChatGPT came out, maybe they had some regrets about not accepting my little editorial there. But I was also doing some of the things that have kind of become cheesy since then. Like, ChatGPT wrote the first paragraph of this article, and I bet you couldn't guess like those sorts of
Oh, yeah.
things. But yeah, early adopter and still trying to wrap my head around what it is all going to mean.
I suspect that every blogger wrote at least one post with that theme, and I'm as guilty as anyone of having done that. I will say, in the conversations that I have with folks, there's still a divide between folks who have who have really delved into some of the platforms and those who haven't. And as you're referencing, it's so powerful that the first thing I always say is, if you're not using it, that's the number one thing that anybody in education should be doing, because I strongly believe there's a huge difference between hearing about it and actually using it. And I know that you were one of the very early folks using it, and we're going to hear some more about that. I do want to bring in Derek, and I had mentioned that Michigan Virtual is one of our digital learning collaborative state affiliates. Derek is with StrongMind. I'm going to go to you in a moment, Derek, for your introduction. And I'll mention StrongMind is a digital learning collaborative founding member, also a DLAC Gold sponsor. They've been at the center of really pushing the digital learning field forward in very generous ways for many years now. And Derek, it's a pleasure to have you on board. Can you talk a little bit about your background and what you've been seeing, and just a quick intro about what StrongMind is doing with AI? Derek, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm the head of product and technology at StrongMind, and really we're in process of building our next generation platform. It's really about putting teachers back at the center of the classroom, making parents rock stars, and really bringing sense of place back to virtual school. And as part of that, we're really starting to leverage a lot of AI in doing so in a number of ways. One of the big ways is in content creation. I think we are rolling our sleeves up and doing a ton in the way of actually using and building our own LLM. So we're not just doing chat kind of back and forth with what you see in GPT, but we're actually writing platforms and systems and building our own AI underneath the hood. So, I think we can deep dive into a lot of questions that people might have around how this pertains to education and some of the nuances of things beyond just GPT.
So I'm going to kick this off with a question that came in, and it's one that we haven't discussed before. So I'll put it out to either of you. One of the questions that came in is, what is AI? And I don't think we want to delve into a highly technical definition, but maybe I'll start with Derek. Your thoughts about, how do you frame the discussion about what is AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think you've got everything from NLP, which is like natural language processing, in terms of, that's the, when you talk to Alexa or you talk to Siri, like it's smart enough to understand and parse that and turn that into, something that the computer can understand. That's a form of AI. If you look at ML, machine learning, recommendation systems, algorithms, that's all some form of artificial intelligence. I think the current wave of artificial intelligence is much more talking about the large language models that tend to be that a machine can kind of think. And historically, they would be that they're trying to pass a Turing test, right? That a machine can actually show some signs of being smart. And then if you look at AGI or generative intelligence, it's even one step further. So, I mean, I think what we're seeing is the bar keeps being raised from, like, can I ask a simple question, or can I orate a question, and can the computer respond to that, to can the computer actually start to think on behalf of itself and give me back responses that I can't distinguish as being not from another human being, right? And I think that's why you see a lot of the articles around, like, hey, this article was generated. It's like, it's the point where you can't tell where the human ends and the machine begins in some of these use cases, right?
And that's the Turing test that you reference, right? The idea that if you're chatting with one of these systems, that you can't tell whether it's a human or a bot. Yeah, I think it's, I love the way you're framing that. Another way that I've heard that I found very useful was, this person I saw presenting on this was talking about how there's a tendency for people when they're first interacting with ChatGPT or one of the other platforms to treat it like a search engine, where the better way to think about it is to treat it like a research assistant, which is a little bit easier if you have a post-secondary background or some other position where you've got a research assistant, but you're able to ask questions much more broadly and ask for refining and ask for different takes on things and things like that. Justin, I wonder how you would build on what Derek said. And the other thing I'd put to you is, what do you think has made ChatGPT I believe it's the fastest adopted technology in history, and I wonder about your comment on that. What's making that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Derek. And I think when I go out and talk about AI, I even say I'm going to use the broadest, simplest definition possible, because there's argument within the field of artificial intelligence research about what constitutes AI and what isn't, right? So we lean on some other resources, like it's a great curriculum from MIT called Day of AI, and they basically help students take a look at different technologies and say yes AI or no AI. And they've got some key questions to kind of determine those answers. Can it perceive its environment? Does it learn over time? Can it make plans? Does it interact with that environment? Is it intelligent, or is it simply following its programming? I think what the appeal behind ChatGPT is that, at least to the layperson and like the person's interacting with ChatGPT for the first time, and especially if you're using it in kind of like an extended session, if you spend more than 30 minutes or an hour with it, it does look like it's doing a lot of those things. It is super impressive. It's very weird to interact with a technology that's designed to interact with you like a human. So you talked about like a researcher or an intern. I like this comparison. I think Ethan Malik wrote this. He said, like, AI is not good software. At least right now, it's not good software. It's great technology, but it's not kind of purpose-built, function-driven software. So you really have to spend time with it to push its limits, to figure out where its boundaries are. And once you do kind of uncover that capability and you spend that extra time with it, you really see how capable it is. I think, when we talk about the usage numbers, I think a lot of people are getting use out of it in their day-to-day work, just task execution, simple writing tasks. I think I've seen a lot of numbers that show a lot of freelance job requests on platforms like Fiverr and others have kind of plummeted in the last few months. So
Yeah.
I would guess AI has been really influential in those areas. Coding, I think, ChatGPT 4 has the code interpreter, and GitHub Copilot are tools that a lot of coders help with code writing assistance. So I think there's just a lot of practical use out of the gate already. And to think about, that this is the first big iteration of a generative AI tool makes us ask really big questions about where this might all be going in the future.
I want to touch on that last point that you just made, because I think it's so central. I heard somebody make the most simple statement, and yet I found it profound, which was AI is the worst it will ever be today, right? And that to me is so central, because I do continue to see articles and hear presentations that get overly focused, in my opinion, on what it's not doing well. And no question, if you're using it, you have to be very aware of the hallucinations and things like that, right? But from a longer term perspective, I'm not sure that's where a lot of the focus should be. The other thing that came to mind with both of you talking is a sense that hard to describe the way this works in any sense that can be easily explained. And my favorite example, you two may be aware of this, was when one of the systems, I forget which one, apparently taught itself the Bangladeshi language. Are you familiar with this quote? And it was the Google system, and somebody from Google was quoted. It was on a TV interview and asked, "How did it do that?" And his answer was basically, "We don't know." And that's I love that, in the sense that there's all sorts of implications about the fact that we don't know what it's doing and how it's doing it. All right, we have a very lively there's one question in Q&A and a lot in the chat window, which we do prefer. So we're going to go there and start addressing some of these questions, and also work in some of the other things that I want to make sure that we touch on. I said early on that we were going to look to the future, not get caught too much in the present. And Dave Goodrich went right there with the question of what might be the intended consequences of AI in education. Shouldn't we have pause and concern? And I would say anybody who's watched the Terminator movies would have an answer to that. I'll pitch that to whichever of you wants to start.
I can start. I'm sure Derek's got a great perspective on it too, and I'm wondering if this is the Dave that I know, who I used to work with at Michigan Virtual. Dave's a great thinker, and I like reading a lot of his thoughts in his blog and elsewhere. I totally empathize and agree. I think we should be approaching a lot of this with pause and concern. I think ChatGPT was like the rock in the pond that we're still dealing with a lot of ripple effects from. It's going to take time for regulators to catch up. It's going to take time for practitioners to catch up and fully understand what those implications are. I would also think, traditional K-12 education has usually been a little bit slower than other organizations and institutions to adopt some of these technologies. So I do think that might be an advantage to kind of handle some of that potential disruption a little bit more with a little bit more ease. But there's also a potential disadvantage in if schools aren't paying attention to some of those potential disruptions, that more and more folks might leave the traditional public education system too. So you have to find that right balance. And there's not really like one way to say AI is good or bad, right? It'll never be a binary. We have to do as much research and experimentation with the appropriate guardrails that we can to actually define what those benefits are and mitigate some of the harms. And I think we're already seeing a lot of harms. Some of these tools are enabling bad actors, and you've got the rise of voice cloning and misinformation using deep fakes and things like that as these tools get cheaper and easier to access. But we are also exploring potential areas for benefit in teaching and learning, productivity, and elsewhere. So I think all we can really do is be curious and adaptable, take a cautious approach. And I saw Dave's comment about the environmental issues that are there as well. I think we need to hold big companies accountable for their impact on the environment, and hopefully that they're kind of making commitments to mitigate those harms. But yeah, I think it's a much bigger issue, and I could only say we just need to be cautious.
Totally agree. I was commenting in a conference panel, and I was talking about how I thought AI was likely to be transformative, and somebody afterwards said to me something like, "So you're optimistic about this?" And I said, "Well, wait, let's be clear. Saying I think it's going to be transformative doesn't mean I'm optimistic. It means I'm partly optimistic and I'm partly terrified, because this feels like a thing that's really taking off, and I don't know that anybody really knows where it's going." Derek, what's your take on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of the two sides that I look at it. The first side is the like fatality point, death march of like, oh man, what happens when the machines take over, right? Like, what happens when you have a machine that's so self-aware that does that? I tend to think that's a little bit fatalistic, and you can control only what you can control. And I don't think that's in the near term. I think in the near term, the things that I look at that, somebody who's a lifelong learner and loves learning, I know a lot of people that aren't. A lot of people say, like, hey, I read my last book in high school and I never want to pick up another book again. And so when you start to look at things like AI that do so many basic things for you, right? Like at what point now, if I'm in third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, whatever, do I start to say like, well, why do I need to learn to add and subtract? We used to use the calculator example, right? Well, why do I need to learn how to read? Right? I could just, the machine will do that for me. Like I don't, you talk about it like, the assistant, right? The research assistant. Well, if I'm in first grade and I have a research assistant, why do I need to learn how these things work? And I see that as a computer person who's old enough that when computers first came out, the only way you could get a computer was to build your own. And so like I understand how computers work with ones and zeros and all of the pieces. And I see a whole generation of people that I'm hiring that have CSE degrees and master's degrees. And in some ways, they don't fundamentally know even how the internet works. Like when you type something in, like what actually happens behind the scenes and how is all of that working? That's just an abstraction. And so my fear is what happens when things as simple as writing and reading and similar become abstractions that most humans aren't paying attention to. Like what does that do to us as a society? Like what does that do to our creativity? What does that do to our motivation? What does that do to our mental health state, right? Like what happens? Like at what point do we start to, I don't want to say lose some of our humanity, but do we start to revert back to more animalistic instincts when a machine is doing the heavy loading for us, right?
I think there's a lot of considerations around those things, and what I want to do here, I want to acknowledge how important I think that is. That tends to be where I get focused, and one of the ways I think that all educational organizations should be thinking about these issues is to be making sure that they're thinking years out about some of these issues that you just raised, Eric. Having said that, there's some immediate impacts as well, and I want to touch on the one that comes up in every AI in education discussion, which is around academic integrity, plagiarism, and related. Justin, what are you seeing around some of the practices that seem to work in terms of addressing those issues?
So I think when ChatGPT was first released, you saw all these headlines around school districts banning it. I think there are still districts here in Michigan which don't allow access on premises to ChatGPT and other AI tools. I don't totally blame them for just needing time to kind of catch up and understand what this technology can do. But I also think the best kind of more balanced approach is going to basically not try to play whack-a-mole with all these technologies as they come out with new tools or get integrated into our everyday workspaces and tools. That the generative AI piece is going to be here. It already is here. It's going to stay here. It's going to become even more integrated and embedded in what we do every day. So the more important question is, how do we kind of update our own teaching and learning strategies, our own pedagogies, our own assessment strategies, knowing that students will be using them, right? So plagiarism and cheating were never really a binary thing, right? It was never kind of a, yes or no, the student plagiarized or cheated. It's becoming even more of a gray area now. And that just means, I think, that we're going to need to kind of rethink our assessment strategies and our strategies for measuring the process of learning rather than the final output of what that learning might be. So we might be less reliant on 5-page or 5-paragraph essays, or less reliant on even tests, closed book tests and things like that. We have to think really hard about how what we're assessing for, the objectives that we write. I really love this resource from Oregon State University that shows a breakdown of Bloom's taxonomy and thinking about like what a robot can do in the Bloom's taxonomy and what a human can do, and how to kind of distinctly measure those when you ask a student to be assessed in any kind of learning activity. I think that's the conversation we need to be having. I think we need to write the policies, have the guided guidelines for approach and use and those sorts of things, but we really can't put off this question of how we totally rethink assessment in the age of AI either.
Yeah, totally agree. And when you talk about something like getting away from 5-paragraph essays, and I do see there are some districts out there that are talking about doing things like maybe forcing students to just write those in class, even potentially on paper with a pen. And that feels to me like, okay, that's a measure. It's a very stopgap measure, and I understand the need to do that in the short term. That doesn't feel like a great long-term solution. Derek, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably the outlier here in the sense of I'm more futurist than I am an educator. So to me, it's all about, how do we teach kids to leverage AI more and more, right? So rather than say, how do we stop AI, how do we empower a next generation to fully utilize and get all of the benefits out of it, right? And I think what was mentioned is there, and I see it in the chat as well, is I think how do we make learning more human as well, right? Like how do we focus on getting people to have a love for learning, and AI is just an assistant that helps accelerate that learning, right? If somebody hates learning, they want to cheat, like you're probably not going to really deter them too terribly much, right? And now they've just got super tools, and then you're at an arms race at that point of, does the school or does the student have better command of technology when it comes to cheating or stopping cheating? And I think we need to fix the conversation to say, how do we get kids to not lose the love of learning, right? So that to them it's a tool, like they just want to continue to expand their capacity, right, and their capabilities. And how do we focus on that? And I think that's one of the things that AI actually gives us the ability to do is, it's long been said that the problem is, how do I do an individualized learning plan for 30 students or 100 students in a class and make it relevant to each one of them in what fascinates them? If Johnny's into rocket ships and somebody else is into music and somebody else is into rocks, how do I create 3 separate lesson plans for them? Well, I think AI is the tool that starts to say, how can we start to build curriculum and drive instruction so that your AI assistant is tuned to what makes you giggle, what makes you fascinated about learning, and keeps you engaged, right? And I mean, I think that's how we start to change the conversation is how is AI an accelerator instead of something that we have to be afraid of?
Yeah, totally agree. Justin, I wonder if you're seeing in Michigan or other places that you're looking at some exemplary current uses of AI, especially when it gets driven down to a classroom, school, or district level. We have a very wide range of people on this webinar, and I'd like to address as much as possible as we can some of these different places that they're each coming from.
Sure. And I think we're still in such early days, and a lot of practitioners are really slow to kind of go out on that experimental limb. So a lot of folks are even hesitant to do anything until they have a board policy adopted or something like that, right? So what we've seen from an official standpoint is limited. What we've seen is kind of like an unofficial standpoint is a little bit more encouraging. So I've talked with some folks from an intermediate school district here who are looking at how to improve their culinary program as part of their CTE program using AI. So they're looking at buying licenses for ChatGPT for everyone in their culinary program. Because if you think about, what sorts of things you might get assistance from ChatGPT or other tools, recipe creation or ingredient analysis, right? Like you have your own researcher to help you create dishes and menus. And then not to mention the kind of visual capabilities of ChatGPT, being able to take pictures of different tools or pictures of different ingredients and asking it for analysis or having it be a thought partner in creating that menu or that recipe, I think is really, really impactful. We're also working on a pilot with Khan Academy, who I'm sure a lot of people know, and they've recently rolled out their own chatbot that's meant to be specifically designed for learning, to facilitate learning rather than ChatGPT, which is more of a task execution tool. And that, again, we've not even executed that pilot yet, but we want to know and we want to identify those exemplars and spotlight them to the extent that we can. But it's still such early days. We hear a lot from teachers, to Derek's point, using these tools to differentiate instructional materials. I talked to someone at a conference recently who said he just kind of overheard his students having a casual, like non-class conversation about a current event. I think it was a natural disaster in Haiti, maybe. And he was like, oh, I would love, he was an economics teacher. He's like, I would love to just give them a project where they could dive deeper into that. They're already talking about it. They're already interested in it. How could I scaffold that discussion and scaffold that learning? And he was like, in previous years, I wouldn't have done it, or I would have said, I'll maybe think about doing that next year. But now that he's got a ChatGPT or an AI tool, he can create a scaffolded learning experience and measure those standards for his economics class and align it to that current event that just happened that quickly and create a learning experience for those students. So I thought that was a great example that I'd highlight too.
And as you're talking, I'm going back to the idea around, it's a lot easier to have these discussions with anybody after they've started playing with these tools. Because in the abstract, saying, hey, here's the things you can do, it's one thing. In my experience, I think the percentage of people I know who played with some of these tools and then with seemingly no effort started finding things they could do with them, it's about 100%, right? Because they're so incredibly powerful. And so in a sense, listing them almost feels reductionist to me because it's so expansive. And I've seen and heard about people creating lesson plans, and I've heard them about creating rubrics for when they've got decisions about content or technology adoptions or awards for various educators. And you can just go on, and these tools, especially the text ones, are so powerful at basically creating that first draft. And I do think that mentality is what's so critical, because the people who point to concerns like, hey, it got something wrong, it's like, yes, in exactly the way that if you handed this to an undergraduate research assistant, you wouldn't say, oh my gosh, they got something wrong. You would say, okay, I'm checking that, I'm correcting it, and that sort of thing. But there's so many examples. Derek, I wonder if you want to comment on anything that's come in, or if not, I'm going to come back to you with a question. What's your preference?
Yeah, it doesn't matter to me, but there was something that I think a couple people have asked about ELL or ESL, And I think
Yeah.
one of the things that is interesting for us, we're doing a lot with curriculum generation and curriculum generation against standards. And as part of that, one of the things that we do when we play with it is we start to play with the edges, right? And I think this is something that John just kind of alluded to, is the more you can play with this stuff and the more that you can understand how the machine thinks, right, the better it is. I think there's like a John Connor vote, from Terminator, Sarah Connor or John Connor, one of them says, makes a quote at some point to the reason that your son is destined for the future is because he actually understands the machines, right? Like he's different because he actually understands how the machines think, right? And I think when you start to play with AI at a deeper level, you start to understand, that's how it thinks about this, right? And so one of the things we play a lot with when we're doing curriculum generation is what is it like to switch context on the fly with that curriculum generation, right? So, you tend to think of like, wouldn't it be cool? You could translate it to, a different language, right? Or you could help do that. I'm telling you that it's so much more nuanced than that. It's tone, it's voice, it's character, right? And what I mean by that is one of our recent hack projects, we actually had an AI bot that you could tell it in what character you wanted, right? So you could put it into Crush the Turtle from Finding Nemo mode, and all of its conversations with you would be like, this is totally tubular, man. Like you just shoot the wave right through the linear equation right on the other side, and here's your variable, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that when you start to train the underlying models and it understands what it is, it can do unreal transformations, right? Like, we don't think twice if a voice actor were to sit down and to change their voice 8 ways from Sunday. I mean, if you look at The Simpsons, 2 or 3 people voice, the majority of the characters on that show. Well, AI is like that on superpowers, right? Like it can mimic anything, like visually, audibly, like, through text, right? And when we start to think about that, now think about what's possible for ELL, right? And for, personalized learning, like you're in a totally different place of what's possible.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've got a follow-up question for each of you. I'm going to go back to Justin. Justin, question came in specifically around how can AI reduce the workload for teachers but maintain the responsibility of teaching and learning, which does seem at the heart of some of the things you've already talked about. But I am sensitive to the idea that, especially for teachers, it's pretty easy to see this as something else they have to figure out on top of already packed and hectic schedules.
Yeah, that's a tension we navigate when we talk with schools, right? Oh, it's another thing I have to learn. So you really have to be providing them with quick wins. And we've seen a lot of natural onboarding into things like Magic School or Diffit, these other like lesson creators and tools like that. I've also heard people say like, oh, I could use this to grade papers. And that I think is a much more electric question, I guess I would say, right? So if you're going to use AI to grade your papers, are you still an active participant in that student's learning and in that student's teaching, right? I think that's an open question. How much of that feedback are you going to take from AI and then make into your own, or bring in your own personal knowledge and experience from that student or of that student into that feedback? I think that could be a way to, again, get you started and maybe personalize the feedback that AI provides on that written work or on that work that you fed it. But that finding that line and finding the real gains in productivity or time saved, and still preserving your domain expertise and your preserving your time to build a relationship with that student, to make them feel heard and valued as a human in your classroom. Those are going to be the things that you're going to have to find how to really find that lane with the use of these tools.
I think if AI has the impact on education that I think it might, emphasis on might, what I'm envisioning is that in something like the 5 to 10 year time frame, the role of the teacher in assessment is going to be to understand each of their students and have a pretty good sense for what they know and what they don't know. Because I do believe, like Justin and Derek, the three of us can have a conversation, and in 2 minutes you can know whether you know something or not, right? And how deeply. And I realize when you get into the details of things like state standards, that gets a little bit harder. But you can't hide behind, oh, I'm going to ask ChatGPT. And so I do think that this has the potential to lead the education system, including public education, in a direction where some private schools already are around teachers really focusing on relationships first. And we hear it especially in our online and hybrid and blended learning space, the idea of we teach kids before content. We think about relationships before rigor. And I think AI is going to accelerate that because it makes the content piece easier while not changing a whole lot, like maybe changing a little bit about how well teachers know their students, and same things around that rigor versus relationships. The AI does rigor really well. It's probably not going to do those relationships quite as well, although that's something else we might come back to momentarily. Derek, I do want to go back to you though, because you mentioned being a futurist, and one of the comments that came in is, aren't educators by their very nature futurists, or shouldn't they be? Which is a fascinating question, and we could probably talk about for our remaining 19 minutes, but I'd love to hear your quicker version answering that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. I think when you look at, we teach to standards, right? So standards are a known state, right? So a lot of what we've done in education for the past 100 years is said, here's a bar, we're teaching to this particular bar, which is very different than saying, we don't know what the bar is going to be in 10 years. We've got to teach skills and sets that are very dynamic to the way that the world goes. And again, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the world wasn't moving fast enough. If I went and got an education and got a degree, the likelihood of what I'm going to do with my degree being very pertinent to the job I'm doing every day is probably pretty high. I think in the last 15 years, I mean, I've graduated with a CSE degree 4 years ago. AI was like research lab only kind of stuff. Nobody was talking about it. Yet a third of the jobs right now are asking that you have deep understanding of these technologies, right? So it's like, how do you even teach for that, right? Like that's like you can't teach for something that didn't exist, right? If Elon puts people on Mars in the next 10 years, we're going to have jobs that when the kid that's in kindergarten today, there is no Mars refuel expert right now that exists. That job doesn't exist, but that could exist in 8 years. Well, how do we train that kid that's in kindergarten today for that, right? And so I don't think it's a negative connotation that maybe teachers aren't necessarily futurists. I think they are stewards of the future, right? Like they are helping enable an entire generation for the future. From that perspective, they absolutely are paramount to our future, right? But I think we got stuck in a system that was very industrialized, and we're now seeing change, which I think is why people are saying AI is very, very revolutionary for education. It's throwing, we have a supercomputer in your pocket that can answer all the things. Then like, what do we teach people? What's important to teach people if a computer can give them the answer to everything?
Yeah, I think we could have a whole webinar just on that very topic, and it would be a fascinating one. Justin, I want to go back to you, and a couple of questions have come in that actually recalls a hallway conversation that you and I had at some meeting in Denver that I don't remember what it was, but it was about the extent to which AI in education is going to be mostly accessed through being embedded in tools that teachers and districts and schools are already using. And I wonder if you could comment on how we're thinking about how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, we were already seeing a little bit of that with some of the bigger players, Google and Microsoft specifically. So if you are a Google for Education school or a Microsoft for Education school, your own organizational tenets of those applications might not have these features rolled out yet, but there will probably be coming soon, depending on your organization or private license and those sorts of things. In a sense, what we've already seen in some of these features that have been rolled out from kind of a beta testing perspective are the ability to write prompts directly in a Google Doc, or take all of that information that you might have already written in a Google Doc, highlight portions of it, and ask the AI to change its tone, to summarize it, to make it into a bulleted list, to totally kind of have a co-writer in that space with you, in your writing space, in your Google writing space. Think about the same thing for slide decks. So your Google Slides or your PowerPoint presentations, using AI image generators based on trying to kind of visualize some piece of information that you're trying to convey there. that's all well and good for like creation and generation. But then if you also think about all of the platforms and systems that schools are really embedded in already, LMSs and SISs, you'll see features rolling out there too that will allow, like to Derek's point, really quick creation of all new learning content or learning objects. More kind of empowerment on either the teacher or the instructional designer to differentiate that within the LMS. Your SIS, right? That SIS is rich with student data in terms of where those students are along different standards or different performance. So I could easily see SISs generating suggested nudges for students, interventions for students based on their performance on certain tasks. Again, it's all kind of back to that rule of, good data in, bad data out. As long as you've got good inference data in those systems, then you could have the potential for really good output using those kind of these new large language models to generate all new recommendations, suggestions, interventions, et cetera.
Yes, and I'll just mention briefly. I heard, I have a good friend who works at Microsoft, not in education, just in Microsoft generally, and he was telling me about the Copilot stuff that's coming out at Microsoft that he's seen that isn't public yet, and it's pretty mind-boggling what that's going to be able to do. It's going to be a huge change, I believe, from what we're used to. Derek, a couple of questions have come in, and they're good ones, and by that I mean challenging. So I'm going to give them both to you. And they are specifically StrongMind related. One is, how does all this discussion we're having affect the academic integrity of asynchronous curriculum that's already been developed, whether that's a StrongMind content or what states and other governments have created? And then the second one, which ties in, is just about how is StrongMind using AI to help design content?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've covered a lot of the integrity side in the sense of the curriculum is still hitting the standard, is still doing all the things. Really, the integrity starts to become in like, how are you assessing the learning, right? Like, so I'm giving curriculum to somebody, I'm teaching somebody, right? Like, how am I assessing that they have mastery of those standards or of that content? And I saw in the chat there was quite a few like, hey, how do you start to make projects or assessments that are more humanistic? Or somebody mentioned even the stopgap of like, hey, we're going to do this like live in person, where you kind of can't have this, right? Everything from proctored exam kind of things where you limit access, etc. But again, I think all of that starts to shift as this stuff comes. I think the conversation starts to shift around, you said it well, John, is when you're in a conversation with people, whether people know something or not on some level, right? And so I think we want to encourage people to use AI to gain deeper understanding of something, but human conversation and humanistic assessment is probably the best way to understand it. It's just hard to scale, right? It's much easier to give 1,000 people a test digitally and get an answer immediately and have it auto than it is sit down and have a conversation and say like, hey, do you really know this? So I mean, now that said, maybe the conversation is with the machine, right? Like maybe I have to have a conversation with the AI, and the AI is now, able to do some of that assessment for me, right? Which gets into a whole nother wave of things. But I think that is probably the biggest concern. But I'll be honest, I think that concern existed a little bit before AI did as well, right? I mean, we heard those questions before. So, I mean, this is just amplifying that. I think when it comes to content generation, I think there's a lot of complexity right now in the world in that, I saw some allusion to, legislatures are necessarily our friends in education. And, so, party A gets elected and the curriculum must look like this. And then 2 months later, 2 years later, party B gets elected and the curriculum now must look like this, or, vice versa, or we learn something new, we have to change the standard. And it's a very labor-intensive process to create curricula that is aligned to state standards. And so if the standards are constantly shifting, which in some ways they probably should be, right? If we're changing and growing and learning, right, it's very hard to come back and do curriculum. And so one of the things we're doing is we're taking AI and we're basically starting with a standard, doing backward design, and having AI basically generate or solve the blank slate problem of it's actually generating all of the content for you, right? And all of the different things. And it's doing it down to the learning object level, right? So a very small component. So those components can be rearranged like Lego pieces, right? So that you can kind of build whatever curriculum you want, and that you can have adaptive curriculum. So now if I've got all of these learning objects down to level and I've got multiple of them, so I'm covering the same standard, the same learning objective in multiple different ways, I can start to say, hey, if you learn better by video, I can present you video. If you learn better by audio, I can give you audio. If you learn better by, practical, I can give you practical. I can start to do it based on what your needs are, right? But on top of that, I can also start to say, I can see where you're struggling as a machine because I've got all of this data down to this very granular level of what you're consuming and how you're being assessed. I can start to say like, ooh, you're starting to struggle with this. Like maybe we need to give more of that. Or, hey, you're accelerating through that. Maybe I can pull you forward and get the content forward. And the way that, we're really thinking about instructional delivery is right now everybody delivers a course, and that's really antiquated, right? In the sense of a course is this linear thing from A to B, and we expect everybody to do it the same way. Like, I don't know about you, but if I had to sit down and read War and Peace all the time, not that it's a bad book, that's a pretty hefty read from cover to cover. We look at kids today, especially millennials and below, they consume content very differently. They consume what I would call in a playlist mentality. They hop on YouTube, right? They don't even go to Netflix. They hop on YouTube. They watch a 5-minute video. They're getting recommendations of other videos to watch, and they're kind of jumping all around that playlist. I think the school of the future, or the consumption of curriculum in the future, looks a lot more like that. Then I might be spending 10, 15 minutes doing something that's math related, and 20 minutes later, you're going to find me digging into social studies because that's just where my mind went, right? And I'm able to kind of follow through that, right? Or you might have people that are very organized and want to go sequential through the content. So I think we're trying to build content that is very, very modular and is very playlist. So you could build a traditional course like you always see, or you could do supplementals, which are part of it, or you could do something completely random, or you could do something that's completely adaptive based on what your feedback you're getting from the student. And I think that is a game changer that just wouldn't be possible without AI. Like the volume of content required to do that is just not cost prohibitive. It is now with AI.
To your point, I saw, actually, before I say this, I want to mention, so we're at 8 minutes left in our time. This is the most active chat I have seen. So thanks to all in the audience. And I will mention to Denise, if there's any questions that you think we should address that we haven't, please DM them to me so I can work them in. It's been a fantastic conversation. A couple of things I love. I'm seeing in here some side discussion about the role of teachers and how teachers understand students and all those pieces. And that is so central to exactly what I believe, and I think at least in part what we're saying as well. Derek, to your point, I saw a demo yesterday from a company showing me how they could basically insert. My technological terminology may be out, but thinking about it sort of like a middleware layer between content and AI platforms, and giving prompts with the idea being that their middleware layer connects SIS, LMS, content repository with the idea, like there's all this discussion about what's age appropriate in states like Florida. Well, SIS tells the system how old the student is, which then they've got prompts about what that student will see or not see based on that. And it can be you can set these prompts at a state level or a district level or at a school level. And so that, to me, that gets to a very, very specific point about how this can be used. Justin, I'm going to go to you with two questions. There's something about, Denise just DM'd me about, someone mentioned using AI for quote unquote peer review of a first draft. I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what that question means, but if you do, take a shot at answering.
Yeah, well, we've seen some examples of this and have played around with it. Basically, what I'm interpreting it as is how to use ChatGPT as a peer. Like, if you were a peer, could you review my writing and give me some feedback on it before I turn it into my grader? I'll maybe just give another quick example that I love. Ethan Mollick, the guy who I reference a lot, professor at University of Pennsylvania, he has his students tell ChatGPT to act like Steve Jobs and give me feedback on my business proposal or my idea, right? So then Steve Jobs is your peer now, or Ben Franklin can be your peer if you've got an LLM that can kind of represent those historical figures and give you feedback in their voice and with their insights. So I do think that there's a lot of cool potential in using AI for that kind of peer review type process.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. We're at 5 minutes left. In a minute or so, I'm gonna do a quick lightning round, give you each a chance to close us with a minute or so observation. I do want to see, I feel like the one thing that's been in the chat window, some questions have come up that we haven't touched on. We don't have much time, but it is this discrepancy between the conversation we're having with how districts are restricted and what they can do, and state legislators not. I don't think we have a lot of state legislators listening in, and it feels like those conversations aren't happening at this level. And I know this is a very difficult question to put out and say any 30-second observations, but I'm going to do it anyway. Derek, any 30-second observations?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I'm so into the weeds of the technology right now and what the possibilities are. Like honestly, the regulation and the people trying to stop things and government in it is just kind of depressing to me. So I've not been following it nearly as much as I normally would, because I want to be excited about where we're going instead of being held back from where we are right now today.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. That would have actually been a good closing comment, but I'm still coming back to you in about 2 minutes for your closing comment. Justin, anything on the policy side?
I think just leveraging the relationships you have, making your voice heard, writing, to what extent you have actually leverage with your legislators right now or policymakers. Be informed, play with the tools, document what you're seeing with them in your schools and elsewhere, to try to, be as informed and valuable of a voice in that process as you can. But that's about it in terms of advice that I might be able to give.
And I see a comment here about equity and access. That could be a whole follow-up one, because I think AI has such potential to be incredibly positive for equity, and it has potential to be the exact opposite, and it's quite worrying for me. I also see in here Alaska is trying to ban AI, which I have to say is funny if true, and I hope it's not. All right, final thoughts, 30 to 60 seconds. What would you like to leave everybody with? Derek, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm going to say AI is a tool, not the teacher. And I mean, I think when I talk to teachers, they got into this profession for a reason. It wasn't because they thought they knew the most about the subject or that. It's because they really cared about kids and they cared about, being able to raise another generation to be learners and to love that. And I'm telling you right now, what I see in AI is super smart, but it's not human. And it's just a tool. It's just a tool, and it's not a human. And so I think my takeaway is we just need to remember that. Like, how do we keep the humanity in education and leverage AI as just a super tool, right? That it helps accelerate what we do.
Yep, totally agree. Justin, final word.
100% agree with Derek. Just a tool. It's inert. Like, it has to respond to prompts, right? And so what do you as a human do? You have agency. You can interact with those kids based on your everyday interaction with them, your knowledge of them, your care for them. So I would encourage you to double down on that skill and that empathy as educators. And what we tell people, like, you can try to shape the future as much as you can with as much power as you have, but ultimately only what you can control is yourself. So think about the dispositions that you should have as this technology just rapidly advances at exponential rates. We talk about focusing on intentionality, using the tools with intention to understand where they have benefit, being collaborative, finding other people like this, sessions like this, to understand where the good use cases are coming about, and then just being adaptable, because it's all going to change in 6 months when GPT-5 or Gemini Ultra get released more broadly. So just buckle up.
Yeah, totally agree. Derek, Justin, fantastic conversation. Folks listening in and chatting, I appreciate all your comments. I think we have a closing slide with contact information that I will ask folks to put up. But we are at the end of our time. I do appreciate all the commentary. And as Denise has mentioned in the chat window, there will be some follow-up around some of the topics that weren't touched on. So with that, again, Justin, Derek, thank you for being here. Thanks for joining StrongMind. Thanks for supporting this. We appreciate all of you and look forward to seeing you all. It might be what might be a round 2 on this. Thanks very much.